Blackwood Creek was one of those towns that seemed stuck in a time warp, forgotten by the hustle and bustle of the wider world. Its population barely nudged 3,000, and everyone knew everyone else, if not personally, then by reputation. Narrow cobblestone streets snaked between houses built in the 19th century. Paint had long peeled from the facades, revealing time-darkened planks and bricks, and roofs were covered in moss that locals had long given up trying to clear. I arrived as a correspondent for the state newspaper, tasked with writing an article about small-town life. I planned to spend a week, gather material on local traditions, maybe dig up some interesting stories from the old-timers. But what I encountered far surpassed all my expectations and still haunts me to this day. The first signs that something was amiss in town appeared the day I arrived. I checked into the only local inn, a 2-story wooden building with a leaning porch. The owner, an older woman with tired eyes, greeted me warily. Her hands trembled as she wrote my details in a worn registration book, and her gaze kept darting to the window as if she expected to see something terrifying out there. The room I was given was on the 2nd floor. The furnishings were Spartan: an iron bed with a sagging mattress, a wooden table with peeling paint, a single chair, and an old wardrobe whose doors refused to close properly. Wallpaper peeled at the corners and yellow stains from leaks spread across the ceiling. But what struck me most was the silence. In small towns, you usually hear the sounds of life: dogs barking, children playing in the street, the creak of wagons. Here there was an oppressive silence, broken only by the rare footsteps of adults and the creaking floorboards in old houses. I spent my first day getting acquainted with the town. I walked down the main street, popped into the local store where the saleswoman, a middle-aged woman with a weathered face, answered my questions monosyllabically, constantly looking over her shoulder. A strange tension hung in the air, one I couldn't explain. People avoided long conversations, finished their errands quickly, and hurried home, even though it was a sunny day, perfect for a leisurely stroll. What particularly struck me was the absence of children. In small towns, kids usually play in the streets, running between houses. Their laughter and shouts create a special atmosphere. Here the streets were empty. Only occasionally did I catch a glimpse of children's eyes watching me from behind curtains. But as soon as I approached, the silhouettes vanished into the depths of the houses. That evening I decided to eat at the local diner, the only establishment of its kind in town. The small room with its low ceiling and faded photographs on the walls was almost empty. At a corner table sat an elderly man with a gray beard, slowly stirring his tea. The waitress, a girl in her 20s with a pale face and dark circles under her eyes, brought me a meager dinner: potato soup, a slice of dark bread, and tea in a glass tumbler. Trying to strike up a conversation, I asked the waitress about life in town, about local attractions. She answered reluctantly, constantly glancing at the door. When I mentioned how few children I'd seen in the streets, her face visibly paled. The old man in the corner suddenly looked up and stared at me intently. His eyes were watery blue and his gaze seemed distant, detached. After dinner, I returned to the inn and tried to write down my first impressions. But the words just wouldn't form a coherent narrative. Something was wrong with this town, but I couldn't put my finger on it. The atmosphere was oppressive, like before a thunderstorm, even though the sky remained clear. That night I was woken by a strange sound. At first I thought it was the wind, but then I realized someone was scratching at the side of the house. The sound was rhythmic, methodical, as if someone was painstakingly carving something into the wood. I went to the window and looked out into the street, but saw nothing in the moonlight. The sound continued for about an hour, then abruptly stopped. In the morning, as I left the inn, I noticed the wall of the neighboring house. Strange scratches were visible on the darkened planks, not random, but forming a pattern. The lines came together in geometric shapes: triangles, intersecting circles, wavy lines. The drawing was primitive, but it held some ancient symbolism that I couldn't decipher. Throughout the day, I found similar drawings on several other houses. All of them were fresh, clearly recent. When I asked locals about these marks, they pretended not to understand what I was talking about or quickly changed the subject. By the evening of the second day, I realized I was dealing with something more serious than simple small-town insularity. Something strange was definitely happening in Blackwood Creek. And these drawings were just the visible part of the mystery. Trying to find information in the local library, a tiny room in the school basement, I encountered an elderly librarian named Mrs. Hayes. She turned out to be more talkative than the other locals, perhaps because she was more used to conversing with books than with people. When I showed her the sketches of the strange symbols I'd made during the day, her face changed. Her wrinkles deepened, and her eyes filled with an ancient fear. Mrs. Hayes had worked at the library for 40 years and remembered a time when Blackwood Creek was a vibrant, thriving town. Back then, there was a sawmill, a train station, and children from surrounding villages attended the school. But gradually, life began to fade. The mill closed, the railway was dismantled, and young people moved to bigger cities. But the real problem started 3 months ago. That's when the first child disappeared, 8-year-old Timmy Miller. The boy was playing in his backyard and simply vanished. His parents searched the entire town, contacted the police, but found no trace. A week later, a girl named Lily Brooks, 7 years old, went missing. Then 2 more children. In total, 5 children between the ages of 6 and 9 had disappeared from town in just 3 months. The police investigated, but to no avail. No witnesses, no leads. The children seemed to dissolve into thin air. Parents fell into despair, and the remaining residents began hiding their children at home, afraid to let them out. And it was after the first disappearance that the strange drawings began to appear in town. At first, there were few and people paid them no mind. But with each new missing child, the symbols grew more numerous. They appeared at night, as if someone or something was marking territory. The librarian told me she had seen similar symbols in old local history books. According to legends, these lands, long before the town was founded, were inhabited by ancient tribes who worshipped forest spirits and performed blood rituals. But those were just legends, weren't they? The next day, I decided to launch my own investigation. Mrs. Hayes had given me the addresses of the families whose children had vanished, and I set out, hoping to uncover more details. My first stop was the Miller family, the parents of the first child to disappear. The Miller house stood on the outskirts of town, in an area where the homes were particularly old and dilapidated. The 2-story wooden structure had once been painted blue, but now the paint was peeled and flaking, revealing time-darkened planks. The porch sagged, the steps creaked underfoot, and the windows were covered with thick curtains that let in not a single ray of light. Eleanor Miller, the mother of the missing boy, didn't open the door immediately. I could hear her fumbling with locks and chains for a long time. There were clearly several of them. When the door finally cracked open, I saw a woman in her mid-30s, but looking much older. Her face was gaunt, her eyes sunken, and her hair hung in unkempt strands. She clung to the doorframe as if she might collapse without its support. Eleanor reluctantly invited me in. Inside, the house was dim. All the windows were tightly curtained, and the only light source was a table lamp in the corner of the living room. The room was furnished with old pieces that might once have been beautiful but now looked shabby and neglected. Children's toys covered in dust sat on the shelves, toy trucks, blocks, a worn teddy bear with a torn ear. Eleanor noticed my gaze and quickly turned away. She told me about the morning Timmy vanished. It had been an ordinary, unremarkable day. The boy had eaten breakfast, gone out to play in the yard just as he did every day. He had a favorite game. He'd take his toy cars and build sand roads near the old apple tree that grew in their yard. Eleanor was preparing lunch, occasionally glancing out the window at her son. The last time she saw him was around 11 in the morning. He was sitting under the apple tree, diligently digging with a small shovel. When she called him for lunch at 12, Timmy was no longer in the yard. At first, she thought he'd gone to play with the neighbors' kids, but it quickly became clear that no one had seen him. The boy's toys were still lying under the apple tree, and an unfinished road was visible in the sand. It was as if the child had simply evaporated in the middle of his game. Eleanor's husband, Victor, worked at the local sawmill, one of the few businesses still operating in town. He was a strong man with calloused hands and a weary gaze. When he was told about his son's disappearance, he dropped everything and, along with neighbors, scoured the entire town and its surroundings. They searched for 3 days straight, looking in every shed, every ditch, checking the banks of the creek that flowed a mile from town. Nothing. The police arrived the day after the disappearance. 2 tired sergeants asked a few routine questions, examined the yard, took the parents' statements, and left, promising to take all necessary measures. No one saw them again, but the worst started after that. On the 3rd day after Timmy disappeared, Eleanor noticed strange scratches on the wall of their house. They appeared on the side where the apple tree grew, where the boy had been playing. The drawing was complex and terrifying. Intertwining lines formed something resembling a spiderweb with a triangle containing a circle in its center. Victor tried to paint over these marks, but the very next night they reappeared, even clearer than before. After their son's disappearance, the Millers hardly left their house. Eleanor quit her job at the local store. Victor only went to the sawmill and returned home immediately. They installed extra locks, boarded up the first-floor windows, and put up a tall fence in the yard. But it didn't help. Every night new symbols appeared on the walls of their house, as if something invisible was marking its territory. The next house I visited was that of the Brooks family. Their daughter Lily had vanished a week after Timmy. The Brooks house was in the center of town, next to the abandoned church. It was a stone building, sturdier than most local constructions, but it too bore the stamp of desolation. Maria Brooks, the mother of the missing girl, met me in a state close to hysteria. She was a thin woman with nervous movements, constantly fidgeting with the edge of her scarf. Her husband, Alex, worked as a mechanic and spent most of his time in his workshop, trying to lose himself in work. Lily's disappearance was even stranger. The girl had gone to the store for bread. The walk took no more than 10 minutes. The shopkeeper later confirmed that Lily had come in and bought a loaf as usual. But she never returned home. All that was found was her basket halfway between the store and the house. The bread lay beside it, untouched. What was especially unsettling was that Lily disappeared in broad daylight on a busy street. But no one saw or heard anything. It was as if the girl had been walking down the street and suddenly ceased to exist. After their daughter's disappearance, drawings also appeared on the Brooks house. They were different from those I'd seen at the Millers, but the overall style was the same. Ancient, primitive symbols scratched into the walls by an unknown force. Maria said that sometimes at night she heard sounds, as if someone was walking around the house and whispering something in an incomprehensible language. The 3rd family I went to see was the Petersons. Their son, Pete, 9 years old, had vanished a month ago. This was the poorest family I'd met. The father, Nick Peterson, was an unemployed alcoholic, and the mother, Susan, scraped by with odd jobs, cleaning floors at the school, helping neighbors with chores. Their house looked more like a shack, a single-story structure with a leaking roof and crooked walls. All sorts of junk lay in the yard, rusty buckets, a broken cart, piles of old planks. But despite the outward neglect, it was clear that Susan tried her best to maintain some semblance of order. Pete disappeared while playing with friends in the abandoned old school building. The children often played hide-and-seek there. The building was large, with many classrooms and corridors. That day there were 5 children, but when the game ended, Pete wasn't among them. His friends searched for him for several hours, then ran to their parents. The adults searched the entire school but couldn't find the boy. Susan told me this story, crying and wiping tears with a dirty handkerchief. She blamed herself for letting her son play, even though by then she knew about the disappearance of 2 other children. Nick sat in the corner of the room, staring at the wall with blurry eyes. He was drunk even in the middle of the day and reeked of moonshine, but on the Petersons' house the same strange symbols had appeared. They were everywhere, on the walls, on the gate, even on the trees in the yard. Susan tried to erase them, to paint them over, but they reappeared again and again as if some dark force was marking its territory. The 4th missing child was Anna Clark, 6 years old. Her parents were the only people in town with college degrees. Her father worked as a doctor at the local hospital, and her mother taught at the school. Their house was one of the most well-maintained in town, with a neat front garden and a freshly painted fence. Dr. Clark met me warily, but still agreed to talk about his daughter's disappearance. He was a methodical man, accustomed to precision, and his account was clear and detailed. Anna disappeared during a walk with her mother. They were walking down the town's main street, and the girl asked to use the restroom. There was a public restroom nearby, a small wooden structure in the park. Her mother waited outside, but when her daughter didn't come out after 5 minutes, she looked inside. The restroom was empty. There were no other exits. The window was small and too high for a child. Anna had simply vanished into thin air. Dr. Clark tried to find a rational explanation for what was happening. He theorized that a serial abductor was operating in town, somehow sedating or incapacitating the children, and then taking them away. But no traces of a vehicle, no witnesses, no leads could be found. After Anna's disappearance, the symbols also appeared on the Clark's house. The doctor photographed them, trying to find analogs in scientific literature, but without success. The signs were ancient, archaic, but their origin remained a mystery. The 5th and final missing child was Katie Davis, 7 years old. She had disappeared just a week ago, and her vanishing was the last straw for the town's residents. After this incident, parents stopped letting their children out at all. The Davis house was near the cemetery, on the very edge of town. It was an old estate once belonging to local gentry, but now divided into several apartments. The Davis family occupied the 1st floor. Sarah Davis, Katie's mother, was a young woman, but grief had aged her by several years. Her husband worked as a long-haul truck driver and was often away, so the care of their child fell entirely on her shoulders. Katie disappeared from her room at night. Sarah had put her daughter to bed, read her a fairy tale, kissed her goodnight, and closed the door. In the morning, when she came to wake the girl, the bed was empty. The window was open, but it was on the 2nd floor, and below it was a sheer wall with no ledges. No traces were found beneath the window. The most terrifying thing was that in Katie's room, the same strange symbols were found, scratched into the wall next to the bed. They were fresh, as if they had been applied that very night the girl disappeared. After visiting all the families, I returned to the inn with a heavy heart. The stories were different, but the common threads were frightening in their consistency. Children disappearing without a trace, without witnesses, without a struggle, as if some supernatural force was taking them. And each time after a disappearance, these cursed symbols appeared. That evening, I decided to carefully examine the drawings I'd sketched throughout the day. Spreading the sheets of paper on the table, I tried to find a pattern. The symbols were varied, but common elements ran through them. Triangles, circles, wavy lines, spirals. Some drawings resembled ancient runes, others primitive depictions of animals or humans. One symbol in particular recurred frequently, a triangle with a circle inside from which wavy lines emanated. It appeared on every house where a child had gone missing, sometimes as part of more complex drawings, sometimes alone. That night, the scratching sounds woke me again. This time, they were coming from directly beneath my window. I cautiously peered out and in the moonlight saw a dark figure pressed against the inn's wall. The figure was human height but moved strangely, as if its limbs were too long or flexible. It methodically ran something along the wall, leaving scratches in the wood. I tried to get a better look at the creature, but it seemed to sense my gaze and sharply raised its head. In the darkness, I couldn't make out its face, but I felt it was looking at me. That gaze was inhuman, cold and predatory. A moment later, the figure disappeared into the shadows as if dissolving into the darkness. In the morning, I went down to look at the wall beneath my window. There were indeed fresh scratches forming the same triangle with a circle and wavy lines. But the most terrifying thing was that next to the main symbol, a new drawing had appeared, a primitive depiction of a human figure. And that figure was clearly me, after my own image appeared on the wall beneath my window. Sleep abandoned me completely. I understood that I had become part of what was happening, that the dark force hunting the children of Blackwood Creek had now turned its attention to me. But instead of fear, I felt a kind of desperate resolve to get to the bottom of this, even if it cost me my life. In the morning, I went to see Mrs. Hayes at the library. The elderly woman greeted me with visible anxiety. News that strange symbols had appeared on the inn had already spread throughout the town. In such a small place, nothing could remain a secret for long. Mrs. Hayes led me to the library's back room where the oldest books and documents were kept. The air here was musty, smelling of old paper and mildew. Shelves stacked to the ceiling held volumes darkened by time, many of which crumbled at a touch. The librarian retrieved several particularly ancient books. Local chronicles, notes from regional historians, collections of legends and lore. In one of them, dated to the late 19th century, I found mentions of symbols very similar to those appearing on the house walls. The book's author, a certain Frederick Thorne, was a local landowner with an interest in archaeology. He had explored the area around what would become Blackwood Creek and found traces of ancient settlements. According to him, these places had long been considered sacred by the pre-Slavic tribes who inhabited the region. Thorne wrote about strange stone circles he had discovered in the forest a few miles from town. The stones were covered with carved signs, the very symbols that were now appearing on the house walls. The landowner speculated that it was a site of ritual sacrifice, where ancient priests offered humans to the forest spirits. One entry made by Thorne in 1887 particularly struck me. Local elders tell terrifying stories of the forest devourer, a demon that comes for children in lean years. They say it leaves its marks on houses, choosing victims, and then takes them to its kingdom beneath the earth. Of course, these are just superstitions, but it's strange that similar legends have existed among various peoples of this region for centuries. Further in the notes, there were mentions of child disappearances in the late 19th century. At that time, during a particularly harsh winter, 7 children vanished from the villages around what would become Blackwood Creek. The same symbols appeared on the walls of their homes as now. Searches yielded nothing, and in the spring only children's clothing was found in the forest, scattered around the ancient stone circles. Thorne tried to study these circles in more detail, but the local residents categorically refused to accompany him there. They claimed the place was cursed, that evil spirits dwelled there who tolerated no human presence. The landowner went there alone several times, but each time he returned in a strange state, pale, frightened, refusing to talk about what he had seen. The last entry in Thorne's diary was dated October 1889. I can no longer study this place. What I saw there defies rational explanation. The ancient stones are alive. They pulsate with some dark energy. And the symbols, they move, they change, as if written not on stone but in the very air. I forbid my tenants from entering that forest. Let the spirits of the past sleep, let them not disturb the living. After this, the entries ceased. Mrs. Hayes told me that Thorne soon after left his estate and moved to New York City, where he died a few years later under mysterious circumstances. He was found dead in his study, and the room's walls were covered with the same ancient symbols scratched with fingernails. I asked Mrs. Hayes to show me where these stone circles were located. The old woman refused for a long time, insisting that one should not go there, especially now that the ancient evil had reawakened. But in the end, she drew me a map, showing the way through the forest to the place locals called Devil's Ring. The journey there would take about 2 hours on foot. I had to take an old forest road north of town, then turn onto a path that led to an abandoned homestead, and from there, another mile through dense spruce woods to the clearing with the stone circles. I decided to go there the next day, but first I wanted to learn more about the recent events. Mrs. Hayes told me that the strange occurrences didn't start 3 months ago with the first child's disappearance, but much earlier. Last autumn, animals began disappearing in the forest. First, dogs vanished, several stray mutts that roamed the town. Then cats started disappearing, chickens from homesteads. People blamed wolves, though they hadn't been seen in these parts for a long time. By winter, the disappearances stopped and everyone forgot about it. In spring, something even stranger began. Dead birds started being found in the forest, arranged in a specific order, in a circle with their heads pointing towards the center. At first, these were small piles, 10 or 15 birds, then the circles grew larger. The local park ranger, Paul Davis, initially thought it was the work of vandals, but then he started finding such circles in the most secluded parts of the forest where people rarely went. Davis had been a ranger for 20 years and knew these woods like the back of his hand. He was a practical, level-headed man, not prone to superstition. But what he had seen in the forest in recent months had made him change his mind about many things. Mrs. Hayes gave me Davis's address, and I decided to visit him before heading to the stone circles. The ranger lived on the outskirts of town, in a sturdy wooden house with a large garden. A large German shepherd named Blizzard was chained in the yard. But the dog was behaving strangely, pacing frantically, whining and howling repeatedly while looking towards the forest. Paul Davis met me warily, but when I explained the purpose of my visit, he agreed to talk. He was a strong man in his 50s with graying whiskers and attentive hunter's eyes. But now, those eyes held anxiety. The ranger told me about what had been happening in the forest in recent months. Besides the dead birds arranged in circles, he had found strange tracks. Not human, not animal, but something else. They were long, narrow, with claw marks, but too large for any known beast. There were especially many such tracks around the place where the ancient stone circles were located. Davis had gone there several times, checking if anyone was poaching in the protected area. Each time he returned with the feeling that he was being watched, that something large and dangerous was lurking in the forest. A month ago, the ranger found something in the forest that finally convinced him that something supernatural was happening here. In a small clearing about 1 kilometer from the stone circles, he discovered a perfect circle of scorched earth. The diameter of the circle was about 10 meters. The grass and moss inside it were completely destroyed, and the ground was blackened as if burned by hellfire. In the center of this circle lay a pile of bones, not human but animal, yet arranged in a specific order, forming the same triangle with a circle symbol that was now appearing on house walls. The bones were clean, as if picked clean, but there were no tooth marks on them. Davis photographed the spot with his old camera, but when he developed the film, the pictures showed nothing but an ordinary forest clearing. It was as if the camera couldn't capture what the human eye saw. After this incident, the ranger began to avoid the far reaches of the forest, especially those near the stone circles. He felt that something alien, something that shouldn't be there, had appeared in the forest. The animals felt it too. Deer had left the area, birds had stopped singing, even insects were fewer. When the children began to disappear, Davis immediately understood that it was connected to what was happening in the forest. He tried to tell the police, but they just laughed at him. Who would believe tales of mystical circles and sacrificial bonfires? It was much easier to blame everything on a serial killer or accidents. But the ranger knew that wasn't the case. What had awakened in the ancient stones was hungry and cruel. It fed on innocence and fear, and children were perfect prey for it. Davis tried to dissuade me from going to the stone circles. He said it was dangerous to go there, especially alone, especially now that the ancient evil was gaining strength. But I was adamant. Only there in the heart of darkness could I find the answers to my questions. As a farewell, the ranger gave me a hunting knife and a small flask of moonshine. "It might not help," he said, "but just in case. And remember, if you feel like you're being watched, don't look back. Just walk away and don't stop until you're out of the forest." That evening I prepared for tomorrow's journey. I packed water, some food, a flashlight, and a notebook in my backpack. I tied the ranger's knife to my belt, though I knew that ordinary steel would hardly help against what I was about to face. The night passed restlessly. I barely slept, listening to the sounds outside the window. Several times I thought I heard someone walking around the inn, but when I looked out the window I saw no one. Only in the morning did I discover new symbols on the wall, more complex than before, forming an intricate pattern around my image. Mrs. Hayes met me at the library with a grim expression. She brought another old book, the diary of a priest who served in Blackwood Creek in the early 20th century. Father Michael had also encountered manifestations of the ancient evil and tried to fight it with prayers and holy water. The priest's notes mentioned that the stone circles in the forest were built not just as a place for sacrifices, but as a kind of gate between worlds. Ancient priests believed that certain rituals could open these gates and summon beings from parallel realities. Father Michael wrote, "These stones are not merely a pagan monument. They are a portal to another world, a world of darkness and horror. The symbols carved on them are not mere decorations, but magical formulas that, under certain conditions, can come alive and summon ancient demons. I have seen these signs glow in the moonlight, how they pulsate with unholy energy." The priest tried to consecrate the place, but his attempts failed. The holy water he poured on the stones boiled and evaporated. The crosses he set up nearby broke or disappeared. And after each such visit, scratches appeared on the walls of his home, the same ancient symbols, as if warning him not to interfere in matters that did not concern him. The last entry in Father Michael's diary was particularly ominous. "I have realized that I cannot fight this evil with ordinary means. It is too ancient, too powerful. The only way to stop it is to find a way to close the gates forever. But for this, a sacrifice is needed, and a voluntary one. Someone must remain on the other side of the threshold and seal it from within. May God forgive me for what I am about to do." After this, the entries ceased. Mrs. Hayes said that Father Michael disappeared in the forest in the winter of 1923. His body was never found, but in the spring residents noticed that the strange phenomena in the forest had stopped. The symbols vanished from the house walls, animals returned to the forest, and the stone circles became covered with moss and began to crumble. But now, the evil had reawakened. Perhaps the seal the priest had made had weakened over the past decades, or perhaps it required regular sacrifices to maintain, which had not been offered. Either way, the forest devourer had returned, and its hunger was stronger than ever. I knew I was walking towards death, but there was no other way out. Someone had to stop this evil before it consumed all the children of the town, and fate had decided that someone had to be me. In the morning, gathering everything I needed, I set off on my final journey. The forest road was old and overgrown, but still passable. For the first part of the journey, I walked quickly, trying to cover as much distance as possible in daylight. The forest met me with silence. No birds singing, no rustling of small animals, not even the wind rustling in the treetops. The deeper I went into the forest, the denser the darkness became. The trees grew so thickly that they let almost no sunlight through. The air was stale and cold, smelling of rot and something else, the sickly sweet scent of decay. By midday, I reached the abandoned homestead Mrs. Hayes had mentioned. Only foundations and charred logs remained of the buildings. This place had once burned, and the fire had been so intense that the ground was still black. Among the ruins, I found several grave markers. Apparently, those who died in the fire were buried here. From the homestead, the path became even more overgrown. I pushed through dense bushes and fallen trees, constantly checking my compass. Gradually, the forest began to change. Ordinary birches and spruces gave way to older species, oaks with twisted trunks, pines whose branches intertwined into bizarre patterns. And then I felt it. I was being watched. It was a subtle, barely perceptible sensation, but absolutely clear. Someone or something was tracking my every step from deep within the forest. I remembered the ranger's warning and didn't look back, but my hand instinctively reached for the knife's hilt. The feeling of being watched intensified with every step. The forest around me grew darker and more menacing. The trees seemed like living beings, their branches reaching out as if to grab and stop me. The bark on the trunks was covered with dark patches, which, upon closer inspection, turned out to be the same ancient symbols that appeared on the houses in town. The path became less and less discernible, and soon I realized I was no longer following it, but simply pushing through dense undergrowth in the direction indicated by my compass. Thorny bushes tore at my clothes, tree roots snagged my feet, and low branches lashed at my face. But I stubbornly moved forward, understanding that there was no turning back. The sun began to set as I finally emerged into a clearing. What met my eyes surpassed all my expectations and filled my soul with primal dread. In the middle of a circular clearing about 50 meters in diameter stood ancient stone pillars. There were 13 of them, forming a perfect circle. Each pillar stood 3 to 4 meters high and was covered entirely with carved signs and symbols. But the most chilling thing was that these symbols seemed to have a life of their own. In the fading sunlight, they shimmered, changed outlines, and moved across the stone surface like snakes. Some signs glowed with a faint greenish light. Others pulsed red, like the hearts of demons. In the center of the stone circle was a large, flat stone, clearly an altar. Its surface was dark with centuries of ingrained blood, and grooves were carved around its edges to drain sacrificial blood. The ground around the altar was scorched black, and the stone itself felt warm as if an underground fire burned beneath it. I slowly approached the stone circle and immediately felt the air around me change. It became denser, as if filled with an invisible energy that pressed on my body and made breathing difficult. My ears rang and strange visions began to dance before my eyes. I saw this circle as it had been thousands of years ago. Around the altar, people in animal skins danced, their faces painted with ritualistic pigments. They sang in a forgotten language, their voices merging into a horrifying cacophony. On the altar lay a small figure, a child bound with leather straps. Its eyes were wide with terror, but no sound escaped its mouth. A priest in a human skull mask raised a stone knife. The blade gleamed in the firelight, and when it descended, the child's blood flowed along the altar's grooves, soaking into the earth. At that very moment, the symbols on the stones flared with bright light, and a column of greenish flame rose from the center of the circle. The flame took the form of an enormous creature with the body of a human and the head of a predatory beast. Its eyes burned like embers, and long fangs hung from its maw. This was the Forest Devourer, the ancient demon worshipped by the local tribes. It accepted the sacrifice, sated itself on child's blood and innocence, and then dissolved back into the flame. The vision disappeared, and I was back in the present. But now I understood what had happened. Ancient rituals had awakened something terrifying that had slept underground for centuries. Periodically, this being would awaken, demanding new sacrifices, and that's when the child disappearances began. The priest, Father Michael, had somehow managed to seal the demon by sacrificing himself. But the seal had weakened, and now the Forest Devourer was hunting again. 5 children had already become its prey, but it wasn't enough. It wanted more. It yearned to return to our world completely. The sun set, and the clearing plunged into twilight. The symbols on the stones began to glow brighter, and the air filled with that same sickly sweet scent of decay I'd felt in the forest. A rustling came from beyond the trees, and I realized I was no longer alone. First, shadows appeared, amorphous silhouettes gliding between the trees. Then I saw them more clearly. They were children, the same 5 who had vanished from town. But they had changed. Their skin was gray. Their eyes glowed with a green fire, and their movements were mechanical, as if controlled by an alien will. Timmy Miller walked in front, his once cheerful face now deathly pale and immobile. Following him were Lily Brooks, Pete Peterson, Anna Clark, and Katie Davis. They were all dressed in the same clothes they had worn when they disappeared, but the fabric was blackened and decayed, as if the children had spent not months but years in the earth. They slowly approached the stone circle, and I understood they hadn't come for no reason. Their souls had been enslaved by the demon, their bodies turned into puppets. They were the guardians of this place, the keepers of the ancient secret. The children surrounded me but didn't attack. They simply stood silently, gazing at me with their dead eyes. There was no malice or hatred in their gaze, only endless sadness and a plea for help. They wanted liberation but couldn't express it. Then a mist began to rise from the center of the stone circle. It was greenish, glowed from within and moved against the wind. The mist thickened over the altar and a figure began to form from it. First, enormous clawed paws appeared, then a muscular body covered in scales, and finally, a head with burning eyes and a maw full of fangs. The forest devourer was even larger than I had imagined. Its height reached 4 meters, and an aura of primal dread emanated from its body. When it fully materialized, the symbols on the stones flared so brightly that I was momentarily blinded. The demon spoke, and its voice was like the grinding of stone against stone. It spoke in an ancient language, but somehow I understood every word. It spoke of its hunger, of how long it had slept underground, dreaming of returning to the world of the living. Children's souls gave it strength. Their innocence was the sustenance it fed on. 5 victims were not enough for full awakening. It needed one more soul, but a special one. The soul of someone who came here voluntarily, knowing they were walking to their death. My soul was exactly that, and the demon had been watching me for a long time, guiding my actions, pushing me towards this moment. But it offered me a choice. I could become its servant like these children, and then it would grant me eternal life in its realm of darkness. Or I could accept death and free the children's souls, but then the demon would still find a way to return. It would just take more time. I looked at the children surrounding me. In their dead eyes, I saw desperate pleading. They wanted peace, wanted release from this nightmare, and I knew I had no choice. Drawing the knife the ranger had given me, I stepped towards the altar. The children parted, making way for me. The demon let out a satisfied snarl. It thought I was giving up, that I was ready to become its willing sacrifice. But instead of lying on the altar, I began to recite the prayer I had learned from Father Michael's diary. It was a special prayer of exorcism, written in Old Church Slavonic. The words burned my lips, and the air around me began to crackle. The demon roared with fury. It understood that it had been tricked, that I had come not to be a victim but to complete the work begun by the priest. It lunged at me, but I continued to recite the prayer, even as its claws tore at my chest. The pain was unbearable, but I didn't stop. With each word of the prayer, the light around me grew brighter, and the demon weakened. Its body began to lose density, to dissolve into the air. It desperately clung to the material world, but the ancient magic was stronger than its will. The children also began to change. The green fire in their eyes extinguished. Their gray skin began to blush, and signs of life appeared on their faces. They were being freed from the demonic spell. Their souls were returning to them, but liberation required sacrifice. The demon, as it vanished, took with it a part of the life force of everyone in the circle. The children began to grow pale, their breathing becoming fainter. I understood that we were all dying, but at least we were dying as humans and not as slaves of ancient evil. Timmy Miller was the first to approach me. His eyes were alive again, full of childish fear and gratitude. He wanted to say something, but didn't have the strength. The boy smiled and closed his eyes. One by one, the other children came to me. Lily Brooks pressed against my side as if seeking protection. Pete Peterson took my hand. Anna Clark and Katie Davis stood nearby, holding on to each other. All of them were calm, no longer afraid. They knew their torment was over. The prayer was ending, and with it my life was ending too. Blood flowed from the wounds inflicted by the demon. Strength was leaving me. But I was happy, because I had fulfilled my mission. The ancient evil was banished, the gates to the other world sealed, and the souls of innocent children freed. The last words of the prayer left my lips, and the stone pillars cracked. The symbols on them faded and disappeared, and the stones themselves began to crumble. The altar split in half, and from the fissure erupted a pillar of white light that rose to the stars. The demon let out a final, furious howl and dissolved completely. Its presence vanished from this world, and with it the darkness that had poisoned these lands for centuries also disappeared. The children, one by one, lay down on the grass. Their faces were peaceful and their lips touched by a faint smile. They fell into an eternal sleep, but it was a sleep of peace, not of curse. Their souls were free. I also felt life leaving me. Falling to my knees beside the children, I looked at the stars through the treetops. The sky seemed clearer than ever, and the air was fresh and transparent. The curse was lifted. In the last minutes of my life, I thought of these children's parents. They would never know the truth of what happened to their kids. They would wait, hope, suffer. But their children were no longer suffering, and that was what mattered most. I thought of Blackwood Creek, where there would no longer be strange symbols on the houses, where children could play in the streets again, unafraid of vanishing. My death was not in vain. The last thing I saw before darkness consumed me were the children's faces. They slept peacefully like angels, finally freed from earthly suffering. And above us the stars shone, eternal, unchanging witnesses to human sacrifice and triumph. When dawn broke, the clearing was empty. The stone pillars had turned into piles of rubble. The altar had crumbled to dust. In the place where bloody rituals had been performed, wildflowers now grew. The forest came alive again. Birds sang, leaves rustled, and the stream that had been poisoned by demonic energy for centuries flowed cleanly once more. Our bodies, mine and the children's, were never found. Perhaps they dissolved with the disappearance of the ancient evil. Perhaps the earth took them into its embrace. But their souls were free, and that was all that mattered. In Blackwood Creek, life slowly returned to normal. The symbols disappeared from the house walls. People stopped being afraid to let their children out. The truth of what happened that night in the forest remained a secret. Officially, I was reported missing during a walk in the woods, and the children were presumed deceased. But the old-timers of the town sometimes tell a strange story about how one night the sky above the forest was lit by a white light, and in the morning the air was clearer, and the birds sang louder. They say that on that night the ancient evil left these lands forever, carried away by the soul of a hero who gave his life for the salvation of the innocent. Mrs. Hayes, the old librarian, keeps my notes and sometimes rereads them, remembering the journalist who came to write about small-town life and ultimately became the final chapter in a centuries-old struggle between good and evil. She knows the truth, but she doesn't tell anyone. Some secrets are best kept in silence, and in the forest, in the place where the stone circles once stood, a birch grove now grows. Locals go there to gather mushrooms and berries, unaware that they walk on sacred ground, consecrated by sacrifice. Sometimes in this grove you can hear children's laughter, but these are not terrifying ghosts, but the echo of freed souls who have finally found peace. Thus ended the story of the ancient evil that had terrorized these lands for centuries. The price of victory was high, 6 lives including my own. But the evil was defeated, the gates of darkness sealed forever, and innocent souls freed from eternal torment. And in this there is a tragic justice worth any sacrifice.